I like to start out this lecture on mineral nutrition with this image of Dr. Eric Jokla, who's a former silviculture professor at the University of Florida. And he's standing in a forest here. These are loblolly pine trees, and he's leaning against this rather large loblolly pine tree here. And this is next to another loblolly pine right here. And I always like to ask a question. What's the age difference between these two trees? And of course, whenever a professor asks you a question like that in a lecture, it's going to be non-intuitive, right? We're trying to make a point because of some surprising things. You can probably guess then that these trees are the same age. They were planted at the same time, but they're in an experiment in which mineral nutrition was different in this situation than in this situation. And it had a big impact on growth or productivity of those two trees. Number of things that can be taken from that, both in terms of the biology and ecology of mineral nutrition, but also in terms of how management can alter site resources to influence growth of trees, for example. So that's nice context for starting out talking about mineral nutrition and the importance of mineral elements to trees. Maybe the place to start is by defining essential minerals or essential elements. So a mineral element is essential if it's an element necessary for a plant, in this case, to complete its life cycle. So that's sort of a given. The definition is given by the name. It's essential to plant growth and development. And we divide those mineral elements into two categories, macronutrients and micronutrients. And that's just divided based on the quantities of those elements that are generally required by the tree or by the plant. So macronutrients are nutrients that are required in greater quantities. So they tend to be required in the plant in concentrations greater than 1,000 parts per million, which is equivalent to 0.1%. Okay, so that number, parts per million or percentage, that's a concentration in plant tissues. So macro elements are elements that are required in concentrations greater than 1,000 parts per million in general. And those are listed there are the macronutrients or macro elements: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. It then, of course, follows that micronutrients are required in quantities in the tissue less than 1,000 parts per million, or 0.1% concentration in their tissues. So obviously greater than 1,000 parts per million, less than 1,000 parts per million. And those micronutrient elements are listed there: iron, manganese, zinc, copper, boron, molybdenum, and chlorine. I want to point out that it actually is quite difficult to determine which elements are essential, especially for the micronutrients. Essentially what this requires is attempting to grow plants, and these experiments were all done a long time ago with herbaceous plants, for instance, but to attempt to grow a plant in the absence of an element. So maybe in a nutrient solution with phosphorus missing. Can this plant grow and develop? No. That's relatively straightforward for the macronutrients because they're required in greater quantities, but some of these micronutrients are required in vanishingly small quantities, which means that a nutrient solution where you're trying to exclude, for instance, molybdenum, can easily be contaminated with molybdenum. So you might think you have a molybdenum-free solution, but just from dust in the air, that might deposit sufficient molybdenum into your solution to provide sufficient molybdenum for that plant to live. And you might think, oh, this is a molybdenum-free solution, and it really isn't. So some of these experiments were actually quite tricky to carry out. But at any rate, these are in general accepted to be the mineral elements necessary for tree growth and development. Some people, thinking more broadly about nutrients, will also include like carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen as essential elements. Those are elements that are required for plant growth and development. But here I focus on the mineral elements that are required for plant growth and development. Well, for better or for worse, if you've spent much time around me, you've probably found that I have lots of irritants, things that irritate me. So this is one of the things that irritates me. This is a product that you can find at many garden centers, and it's labeled as plant food. You know, why does that irritate me? What is plant food? Plant food is sugars. Right? Plants, trees, are autotrophs. They create their own food through photosynthesis. This box of Miracle-Gro is not a box of glucose. This is a box containing mineral elements. So it's not plant food. If we were going to call it something that was roughly analogous to human nutrition, this would be something like plant vitamins. I still wouldn't call them that, but that would be probably the closest equivalent. So, but for whatever reason, Miracle-Gro doesn't listen to me, so you can still buy plant food at the store. This is an important concept to keep in mind when we're thinking about response of plants and trees to nutrient availability. This is a very general response surface where the y-axis, it's labeled here as growth response, but it more broadly could be thought of as something like plant performance. You know, this could be photosynthesis rate, resistance to disease, any of a number of measures of plant performance, but growth is a good one. And how it responds to variation in this case, it's labeled as tissue nutrient concentration. You could also just think about this as nutrient availability in soil. So the response of plant function to availability of any particular nutrient, and this is usually thought of as one nutrient at a time, which I'll clarify in a minute, really has three phases. The first phase is nutrient limitation, and that's where an increase in nutrient availability results in an increase in plant performance. That happens because that nutrient is limiting. So more nitrogen or more phosphorus, if you add more, the plant grows more or grows faster. That is the definition of limitation. Definition of limitation is that the addition of that limiting element will cause an increase in whatever response variable you're looking at. And then there's some phase at intermediate availability where there's no change in plant performance. And that phase is called luxury consumption. Okay, so luxury consumption would just be a phase where the tree is accumulating that element, but it's no longer limiting, so it doesn't increase performance with addition of that nutrient. And then the final phase is toxicity. You know, this is true of all things in life. You can have too much of a good thing. And that's what happens with toxicity, where at some level, you actually get so much nutrient either accumulating in the tree or in the soil that it causes problems for the plant, causes reduced growth, reduced photosynthesis, reduced susceptibility to insects and disease, and so on. So these three phases are important. Now, there's an assumption inherent in thinking this way, and that is basically this is assuming that no other elements are limiting. So for instance, if this x-axis is nitrogen availability, this kind of response will occur assuming no other elements are limiting. There's plenty of magnesium, phosphorus, sulfur, iron, and so on. And of course, like many things in life, those assumptions don't always hold. There are usually multiple limiting elements at any one time. But in general, this is still a useful concept. And especially the concept of limitation, where in the field, the definition of nutrient limitation is if you add more of that nutrient and you get a response, then that nutrient was limiting. So these are important concepts to keep in mind.